Hello, everybody, and I'd like to go ahead and wish everybody a Merry Christmas. I will not be doing the Philippians study next week, so just want to go ahead and get the Christmas wishes out there. This will be the last time I do the Philippians for until after the first of the year, so we'll pick it back up on be like January 4th or 5th, somewhere around that first Thursday in January. We'll start again, but today I want to look at Philippians 2, 12 through 18, and this is really a closing, the closing end of a section within the body of the letter. Let's put it that way. Clearly, at verse 19, if you were just reading through and you started you're thinking about what was going on and you got to verse 19, you would realize that something different is going on. There's a change in subject. So there's definitely a break that happens at the end of verse 18 before we get into verse 19. So it seems like this section right here that I'm dealing with is basically the end of the beginning part of the body of the letter. Now again, within the body of the letter, you're always going to have, that's where your primary information is at, I should say. This will be where you'll find the most instructions, result, purposes, things like that. This is where the main part of the communication between the letter writer and the letter addressees occurs. And so we expect to find some useful information here for ourselves as far as our relationship with the Lord. So now that body of the letter, again, starts in chapter 1, verse 27. I brought that out a few weeks ago. So that is the beginning of the body of the letter, and it's going to continue all the way until chapter 4, or through a little bit of chapter 4. But at 2:19, we definitely do have a shift. We're going to start moving to talk about Timothy and Epaphroditus, and then later on we're going to talk about Paul in chapter 3, and also talk about his opponents. So we've been dealing with the model of Jesus in chapter 2, specifically verses 5 through 11, and now we have, seems to be some kind of a summary of some of the previous things that Paul has had to say within this section itself. So let's just start working through this, starting in verse 12, and then go through verse 18. I don't think it'll take us too awfully long. Now, at the very beginning of 2:12, most translations, the English translations, I believe, have the word therefore at the beginning. What's so interesting about our English translations is that, and it's not interesting, it's really kind of regretful, is that many times they will translate different Greek words the same way. So there are 3 words off the top of my head that I can think of that mean therefore, or some kind of an inferential, they are an inferential device, particle that's used within Greek. They don't always all mean therefore. That's the thing. They have different communicative constraints. So to translate them all the same way really does some injustice to what's going on. In verse 12, it really is a result statement that's starting here. It's some kind of result. So that is what he's saying. Now, again, the different words that we use for these inferential means, or the words that the Greek language uses within the New Testament, let's put it that way, they have rhetorical purposes. So they do have a purpose within communication. It's just that to lump them all into having the same inferential quality and just to use just the blanket general therefore really doesn't do justice to what's going on at many times within the language itself. It's those little small words that make a big, big difference sometimes with the way we understand certain things. A lot of people just blow through these small words, but it's really, really important. So we have a result statement here. However, it is inferring back upon previous information. So the difference in this type of inferential particle used in Greek is that it expresses a result or a purpose. In this sense, it's going to be Paul expects some kind of result to happen, actually, so that such and such behavior would happen, or something to that effect. From this, there's this action that should flow from it. That's the kind of idea. And that's what we have going on here. So it is referring things back, but it's referring things back all the way through this section, all the way back to chapter 1, verse 27 is what it's doing. So quite a large section of information that we're thinking of, but in a sense, he's summarizing. And so a good way to translate, it's one Greek word only, but we can't translate one-to-one many times with what they're trying to do with their words. It's the same with our English language. We can't, another person, another country or another nationality, another type of language out there would not necessarily be able to translate English one-to-one always either. In this instance, in chapter 2, verse 12, it may be best to translate it as, so that in summation, really, is what Paul's trying to say. So that in summation. Now, yes, I've added some words there, but I am trying to convey what that original Greek particle is trying to, what its purpose is. How is it trying to work within this communicative stream? Now, he goes on from there and he says, my beloved. Now, this is an interesting way to ingratiate yourself to an audience. In fact, this was done many times by Paul. In fact, it's standard in rhetorical type of writing. And we're dealing with Paul's letters. We are dealing with rhetorical writings. In fact, most of the New Testament is going to have rhetorical elements in it. Paul's just better at it than others. He's very good with rhetoric, and he uses these means to try to create a bond between the receivers of the letter and himself. So he says, my beloved. It's an endearing term. It's a way to ingratiate himself to them so that they will be more positive. If they have a positive view about him, and they realize or they perceive that he has a positive view about them also, and he perceives they have a positive view about him, back and forth, let's put it that way, it's going to make the exhortation coming from Paul more likely to be enacted upon just because the people know that Paul has their best interests at heart to some degree. They know that he loves them. And in the other way, he knows that they respect him, so that it's likely that they are going to follow his directives. So he has a high expectation for this behavior to occur. Let's say that. So he ingratiates himself to them, my beloved. And then he says, in my presence or in my absence. Now, this is where it takes us right back to chapter 1, verse 27. Remember, now I've said the particle does it, but we have similar language in 2:12 that also is in 1:27. Earlier, Paul talked about not being present with him, not being absent, how he wants their behavior to be, even though he would be there or not be there. He says that in chapter 1, verse 27. So we have the same idea being presented here in chapter 2, verse 12. So we can start to see how far, as I said, this inference or this inferential reach goes back. It goes back all the way to chapter 1, verse 27. And the result is that from all this material, basically from chapter 1, verse 27 up to 2:11, all this material is going to be important for them to incorporate into their lives in order to stay united, stay in good graces with one another as far as loving one another, and to be humble. So we got a lot of things to think about here when we start to think about what's going on in chapter 1, verse 27 through chapter 2, verse 11. So there's much to unpack here. Let's put it that way. Now, in this verse 12, the very end is very interesting. The very last statement within this verse. So it says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. That's our English translations. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. So what in the world is he talking about? Well, let's just talk about some of the behavior that has been discussed within this section of text. So we've had in 1:27, we have Paul has a concern about the unity of the Christians in Philippi. So he wants them to be united. So they need to be unified. So that's a behavior that they need to incorporate into their lives. They need to be united with one another. They need to have courage against their opponents. So they can't just cower. Now, we're not talking about atheistic opponents here. We're talking about Jewish opponents. And even though the term does not appear in Philippians, it seems to be the same idea that's presented in Galatians. These are your Judaizers. These are Jewish people who are trying to mix the old covenant and the new covenant together and create some kind of a hodgepodge of a new covenantal arrangement. And they also diminish the value of Christ. So they're having a very hard time understanding or accepting the divine nature of Jesus. And so they're having that problem too. So this is not Christian people that he's talking about as far as their opponents. That's not people within the church itself. And it's not, it's not people within their community, I should say. That's more specific. Within their community in Philippi that's causing trouble. And he's not talking about people outside of the community within Philippi, the people who do not believe in God. He's talking about these Jewish people that are disrupting Paul's ministry efforts everywhere he goes. And so he's had these kind of problems in Galatia. He's had it in Corinth. He expects to have these kind of problems in Romans or in Rome, and in the letter of Romans he anticipates this. So when we get to Philippians, yes, it's highly likely that he could still be battling this, and it seems that the writing supports this. And so we even have this kind of idea also being written in Ephesians, the argumentation of Ephesians. So Paul is battling these people again. They're not battling one another, even though Paul wants them to be united. He's talking about these Judaizers. He's not talking about atheistic people. He's talking about people who they believe there is a God. They just don't believe in the same way that Christians believe about Christ and his relationship. And then in chapter 2, 1 through 3, Paul talks about loving one another, about being cooperative together, working together, and being united, and displaying humility. Then we have the lesson about Jesus, the way that he modeled his life, and it was about being humble. And so we have all these things coming together. So it's about being unified, it's about being courageous, it's about loving one another, it's about humbling yourself to one another, not thinking highly of yourself, thinking about other people's needs too. So, and the result that comes from this is that Christians should have reverence for this instruction. So this is where we get with fear and trembling. So we should have reverence for this, respect it as being useful for our lives. Again, now the idea is that the people perceive that Paul loves them deeply, and they are willing to follow whatever it is he's going on. He asks them to do. Let's say that. Now, so we have to have this reverence. We have to have courage. This is what he's talking about. And so we have all this stuff prior to this. So we have to keep all this in mind as we're thinking about this one phrase that is so odd about working out your salvation. Work out your salvation. I've heard people misuse this a lot. It cannot be talking about our ability to produce our salvation. In fact, the word work out here is a word that's used to talk about production of something. You produce something. That's the idea generally. But it cannot be talking about our production of salvation on our own behalf. It's just not possible. And one of the reasons why it's not, theologically, it's not possible to even discuss this idea. We start to get into huge problems. Just thinking about the value of the cross or the salvation of Christ and what it means, how it works, so forth and so on. It's not possible for Paul to be saying that we are producing some kind of salvation within ourselves through fear and trembling, that kind of idea. Again, I do think this is about reverence, listening to what Paul's had to say, listening to what the Lord has to say, obviously, but we are not producing our salvation. In fact, in chapter 1, I think it's in verse, well, let me double check here. It's verse 28. Verse 28. Chapter 1, verse 28. Paul is very clear there that our salvation comes from God, is what he says. Our salvation comes from God. And so this is not new information. Paul's always been this way. And so we've got to try to understand, what is Paul trying to say here about work out your salvation? He cannot be talking about our producing it. He's already said in chapter 1 that salvation comes from God. God is the one who gives salvation. It's not that we take it, earn it, or anything to that effect. God is the one who brings this about for us. In fact, if you were to go on and look at verse 13, it would even support what I'm saying even that much more about how God is being so active in our lives. Now, I'm going to stop right there about that. But the point is that this cannot be, this can't have no idea of our being the ones who produce, I would even say, any part of our salvation. Our salvation completely depends upon Jesus. Do we have to be loyal and come into the covenant under his lordship? Absolutely. Absolutely. We are given the Holy Spirit at that time, and we have got to let God direct our lives. Now, remember, we are on a journey of salvation. Why do I say that? Because ultimately, we are not going to find out the end result of our salvation until we go meet the Lord. Either you'll pass before the Lord returns, or you'll be alive when the Lord returns. At that point, you're going to understand what the outcome of this salvation truly is, and that's when it will actually happen. Now, we do talk about the idea of being saved because from God's perspective, he's so faithful that he's not going to take our salvation away from us. But it does seem to teach, and I'm not even going to say seem, the New Testament teaches. I'll just be really upfront about it. The New Testament does teach that people can leave the Lord. Walk away from their salvation. There are examples, there's instruction within like the writings of Hebrews. Definitely about this. We have this character Demas. I could go on and on and on. And the point matter is we're on this journey of salvation, and as long as we stay in covenant with God through Jesus Christ, and you know what that means as far as behavior, we're not going to be perfect people, but we can be devoted people. As long as we stay there, we will find the end result or the final outcome of our salvation when we go to be with the Lord. So maybe a good idea with this last part here, I don't like the way it's translated because it gives us the wrong idea. It really does. Paul is not trying to tell us that we have any part to do in our salvation. He is telling us that we need to behave a certain way because we have the Holy Spirit in our lives. So we have to heed the Holy Spirit's direction. It should just be natural for a Christian to follow this. So maybe a good way to translate this, and this is going to be a little bit wordy the way that I go about it, but instead of saying work out your salvation with fear and trembling, like we're doing something here, maybe it'd be better to do it this way. In your salvation, be mindful and respectful. Be mindful that your salvation comes from God. So you owe your devotion to him. Okay? And then also be respectful. Be respectful of what instruction that you have. Not that I'm trying to earn God's favor necessarily, but I believe that the instructions that God has for me and for you within the New Testament would be the best for our lives. Our lives would be so much better if we would live this way. It's just common sense, folks. And as a Christian, you have that push to behave appropriately, and you have the desire because you love the Lord and you want to. That's about all I'm going to say about that. But let's go on to 2:13. Now again, we're reminded right here that it's God doing the work in us. So again, this working out your salvation, from our perspective, we just accept it. We're not trying to produce it. It comes from God. And 2:13 backs this up. For it's God who works in you to do these things. This is just looking at this as a whole, it makes me think that this would be an excellent portion of text to use as a lesson about context. Because I've heard so many people talk about this passage, when we're talking about the argument between the perseverance of the saints versus those who can fall away. Okay, so we're talking about some people have once saved, always saved, and then others are like, no, we're not for that and that stuff. Really, those two groups need to sit down and talk with one another because what they're talking about is not so much different, amazingly. We just try to soundbite everything, and when we do, we never get the full information about this. But again, this is God doing the work within us, and so we've got to let God do the work. We cannot produce this salvation on our own. So this would be a great place to talk about context, because you could go back to chapter 1, verse 28, where it says, that this salvation, and that is from God, and this is from God. And then 2:13 also corroborates this. So 2:12, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, should make you scratch your head when you're reading it, like there's got to be something else going on here besides that. And so you're going to have to do a little thinking about this. Again, it's not that difficult to find the answer if you have a good working knowledge of the New Testament, for sure. So, 2:14 through 2:15, we have negative behavior that comes up again. Don't do these things without grumbling, without arguing about this stuff. And so they must stay united. Now, even though we're talking about Christians who have the Holy Spirit, a lot of times Christians don't get along. It's the strangest thing. And I really think when Christians are arguing with one another about silly things that really, they're never really, we're not talking about major heretical views here. We're not talking about something very, very serious. We're talking about silly, silly things. When people start arguing and disputing and acting unloving towards one another in the church, the first thing that comes to my mind is that they're not reading their Bibles. They are not reading their Bibles. I don't know how in the world, if you had a daily digest of God's Word into your life, you could ever treat other people in any kind of a harsh manner. I just don't. It just boggles my mind. If anybody had any reason to treat people harshly, it would have been Jesus. And when I see Jesus interacting with people, I find someone who is very kind, very patient, listens, discusses openly, but he's not hateful. And we need to model that type of behavior also. We need to be kind to other people. But anyway, Christians must stay united. And that's going to give us, just a show of strength. That we're in this together. But Paul goes on that we need to stay in this together for another reason. He says there's lots of things going on out there. So we're going into verse 15 here. So you look at 14 and 15, they kind of run together. And so not only are we to be united just for the ability to work better, but look what else he says. So that we can shine as lights to the secular world, is what he's saying. So this reminds me a lot of what Jesus had to say on the Sermon on the Mount. Do you remember when he said that we are to be the light in the room? We are to be he says a city on the hill, a light in a dark room, that kind of idea. But he says in 5:16, let your light shine so that they may see your good works and give glory to the Lord. And we have a similar idea in 1 Peter chapter 2 also. So this idea of Christians working together and producing good ministry efforts that reveal God to people is it's what we're supposed to do. Let's put it that way. This is good behavior. This is what Paul's trying to teach us to do. We have got to work together in order to share the ministry of Christ to others and to bring people into His kingdom. So remember that. So there's no good reason for people in a church to bicker. There's just no good reason to bicker and to argue and then to split. This is just sinful folly. It truly is. And so, again, as Paul says, do all this stuff without grumbling and disputing so that your efforts could be a light of truth into a dark world. He also says that there's a twisted and wicked generation out there. He doesn't use that language. Crooked and twisted is what he uses. Crooked and twisted. But we know it's a wicked generation. So there was a wicked generation back then. There's a wicked generation now. There will always be wicked people within whatever era of life that you're in. There has to be. There was so back then, and there will be until the Lord returns. If you think about it, Christians need to see this kind of lot of people as an opportunity. We are in the conversion business. Now remember, when Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus is getting ready to leave, he commissioned the disciples. He says, if we are called he says, go out and make disciples, right? He tells them, go make disciples. In fact, he says, after going, make disciples by teaching and by baptizing. But the point is that we are to make disciples. Now, if we are called to make disciples for the Lord, think about this. If we are called to make disciples for the Lord, then it stands to reason that there are going to be wicked people out there. Doesn't it? If we're called to do this, then there must be some people out there that need to hear this. So we should expect this kind of lot of people out there. I don't think the church is supposed to be combative. I think that we are in the conversion business. And we should expect for this kind of behavior to be out there. Why? Because the Lord said so. Go make disciples. Why else would he say? Unless he knows that there's always going to be a group of people who are not under his lordship. Let's just say that. So, we're not in the condemnation business in the church. We're not. That's not our role. We don't condemn people. That's God's job. Now, I'm talking about condemning people here, not sin. There is a big difference. You guys know the old saying. You've heard it many, many times. Hate the sin, not the sinner. But too many times we hate both. We're not to do that. We're to hate the sin like God does. He deplores sin. We need to deplore sin, abhor it. But as far as people, we have to have a loving heart. Are they going to be different? Yes. Are they going to have unruly characteristics? Yes. Are they going to be wicked? Possibly. But again, we are in the conversion business, not in the condemnation business. We see sin as a sickness, and we want to pull people out of that sickness. So again, we should expect this to be out there. This is our job, to go out there and do things. Share the light of truth to a dark, dark world. 2:16, he talks about the word of life. It is not talking about the Bible here. This is just basically talking about the message of salvation. Now, I guess you could say the whole New Testament really teaches the message of salvation. True. Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. But the Old Testament doesn't. So this phrase, word of life, cannot be talking about what we perceive as the Bible. Basically, it's just talking about generally the message of salvation. The Old Testament does not give us any kind of instruction about Christian salvation. That only comes in the New Testament. But Christians must trust that this message of salvation is absolutely true. That this message is trustworthy. And that we don't waver. We don't have doubt. We trust the Lord. What he said is true, and we take great confidence in what the Lord has told us. And then in 17 and 18, he ends this section with optimism about his work producing joy, their work producing joy. They're having joy for what Paul's doing, and he's having joy for what they're doing. And so we just have this joy going back and forth, this gladness with one another as far as their relationship with one another. So Paul's ministerial efforts are being productive. He's shared some things already. The church in Philippi bears witness to this also. And then also the Philippians are also doing a great job in their ministry efforts too, and Paul congratulates them also. So that's basically the end of this. I'm going to stop right there. And so this is a summation to this section. A lot of good information here that's very, very helpful. Again, I want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas, and we will not get back to Philippians until after the first of the year. It'll be the first Thursday in January. So I look forward to getting back with you then, and keep on reading and keep on studying. Take care. Bye.